Well, let's get started. I have noon on my clock. Uh, Hello and welcome everybody to another issue of the South Dakota Forest Health Workshop. I am Tony Seidel, your moderator, and we are joined today by Dr. John Ball, Forest Health Specialist and SDSU Extension Forester. And today's topic, tree species selection in South Dakota. So Dr. Ball is going to take us through some underutilized trees, trees that will help spread diversity throughout our urban forest. And I'll let you take it over, Dr. Ball, after I give a quick little disclaimer about our recording. This workshop, like the past workshops, is being recorded. After the recording is edited, we'll put it on our department's YouTube channel for future viewing. I'll also include a link to our Forest Health Workshop playlist in the chat box, so people can go back and look at any of our previous workshops. Since we've made that playlist, we've had it's been well received, and we've had a lot of people going back and looking at our old workshops. So I'm glad that's a useful resource. We do have SAF, Society of American Forester, Certified Forester credits available. If you are an SAF Certified Forester, please put your credentials in the chat box before today's workshop is over. We also have the opportunity for International Society of Arboriculture, Certified Arborist credentials. Dr. Ball will be giving you a code for that CEU at the end of the workshop. That's my disclaimer, Dr. Ball. I'm handing it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you as always. Well, we'll get us started here today. And let's see if it wants to go. All right. So, well, good afternoon, everyone. And today our focus is going to be on some trees to consider, as Tony mentioned. And our focus today is going to be a little bit more on the windbreak side. This doesn't mean everything I'm covering is only for windbreaks. As Tony mentioned, we want to diversify our communities as well. So this is going to cover mostly windbreak, but it will cover some of the ornamentals. And then next month, and we're going to start on our monthly basis now, that will cover a little bit more of the ornamental. But the real thing we're trying to do today is take a look at, well, what are some tree species that we might be able to use outside of town, because that's a whole nother ball game here. So let's get her started here if it wants to go. Well, first of all, we have some considerations, some very critical considerations. First of all, how cold our winters can be. And I know everybody's enduring kind of a brutal winter this year. It's long, it's been cold, and it's been snowy. Now, we like the moisture, no question there. But we've also had quite a bit of cold. And in fact, I expect to see some winter injury because some of those cold temperatures keep coming. But if we take a look at the state, we really have three primary plant hardiness zones. We have 4A, which is at the northern part of our state, dipping down along the Coteau, but that can experience temperatures to -25 to -30. Now, that doesn't count wind chill. That's not a factor. And what we're looking at here is the extreme cold, not the average cold that it gets, but, you know, over a 20-year period, what's the coldest it's ever been? Now, again, this is based on, you know, what the government has come up with. And I'm sure everybody can think of, well, you know, it got down to -32. But nevertheless, it's a pretty good way of looking at it. You get into North Dakota, we're really into zone 3. You get into Manitoba, we're in zone 2. The bulk of the state is in plant hardiness zone 4B, with minimum temperatures of -20 to -25, and that basically fits, you know, over the long term. And then at the very southern end of our state, and also that crescent out in Black Hills, we have plant hardiness zone 5A, -15 to -20. These zones are very important for determining the performance for woody plants. Good example, I frequently get people contact me and say, you know what, I really want to grow a sycamore tree. You know, can we use sycamore trees? I've even had it, can we grow sycamore trees as windbreak trees? Well, yes, I know there's one in Webster up in Day County, and there's a couple of ones scattered. There's one in Millbank, for example, and Grant, and there's a couple scattered, but that's far different than being planted out in the prairie. And really, a tree like sycamore is really more of a 5A to a 5B if you want long-term performance. So it's really not a tree well adapted for windbreaks in South Dakota. We also have precipitation issues. It's a dry state. We all know that. And if you take a look, it tends to go from south and east to north and west in terms of precipitation. The very little area down on the peninsula actually can get above 26 inches of precipitation. You're down in Dakota Dunes area, for example, down at the very bottom of Union County. And then we have that little area there from 24 to 26. And then a lot of the southeastern part of our state and crossing the river into Gregory County, a little bit in Tripp, we can have 22 to 24. And then this kind of long, narrow strip of about 20 to 22 from up in Marshall County over to Todd. And then it drops down to 18 as we start getting to the end of East River. And then for a lot of that area, certainly west of the Missouri, most of that 16 to 18 outside of the Black Hills, of course. And then up in Harding County and Butte County, we actually have less than 16 inches of precip. We have two issues with trying to grow trees in these dry conditions. First of all, just getting them established. You know, it doesn't really matter what tree you're trying to grow, how drought tolerant it is. The first couple of years, they really demand watering. And I've been out and looked at belts, Dewey County, Potter County, you get up in Perkins County. And if they weren't irrigating that first year, even our toughest trees have had a hard time surviving. Once established, there's a lot of trees that can tolerate drought, can tolerate dryness. But to get started, almost everything needs water. But again, as we start going further west and further north, our choices become fewer and fewer. And then we have soils. And if we take a look at our windbreak suitability groups that we have out there, and what we're basically going through today is 1 through 5. They do go 6, 7, 8, and 9, and those are pretty harsh sites. With a 10 is it's essentially a pavement. You're really not planting anything. But a lot of our state fits into these 5 here, and you'll notice that really you get into the 3s and the 5s, and there you've got deep, well-drained, loamy soils that generally are fairly good at supporting trees. We also have 1, which is a reasonably good soil, but unfortunately, sometimes the year it can be poorly drained, you know, ponding and that with a little bit of flooding. 2, it better be able to tolerate moisture. And then we have subgroups too. For example, 1K, meaning a soil that's very alkaline. And we're going to be utilizing these, as many of you do when you're making decisions about windbreaks today, in how we decide what we're going to plant and where. And I should mention this too. This is the book, Deciduous Trees for South Dakota Landscapes. And this is Dale Herman and Norm Everts, those are the 2, that developed a little zone map for the state. And you'll notice it tends to follow precipitation, which is what they were essentially utilizing. And they looked at the most favorable place to be growing plants, of course, that southeast, where we can have a lot of diversity. And then we go into a favorable zone, which again fits that about 20 inches of precip. And then it starts getting acceptable till you hit the river, and then crossing the river, it goes to poor. So we have very limited choices. But their book, they put all their trees into one of these 4 categories, or they might say it'll tolerate all 4, for example, box elder. And then finally, a very important consideration is, can you buy it? Which then means for the nurseries, can they sell it? You know, we all would like to see some other plants out there. I mean, everybody can think of one. I can think of one right off the top of my head, Mongolian oak, and it's almost impossible to find. Well, put yourself in the place of the nursery. You've got to acquire seeds. You've got to start the seeds. You've got to grow the plants. You're putting years into it. And at the end, you better be able to sell it. You don't want to have to clear them all out. And so they're going to be a little on the conservative side. And I don't blame them because they got to really think, they got to think what you folks are going to want 4 years from now, not just today. And we all tend to be a little fickle. And so it doesn't mean we're not getting new trees being tried. For example, Big Sioux Nursery is doing ironwood, a tree that I really like. And they do work with demand. Enough people requested, they're going to start growing it. But it's not like machine parts where tomorrow they can suddenly have a new plant available. And again, I always encourage people, shop local. That would mean start in South Dakota if you can, and certainly utilize the Big Sioux as much as you can for your plant selections and your windbreaks in your conservation plantings. All right, well, why are we going over this? Well, we all know the emerald ash borer, and this is not an emerald ash borer talk, but at this point, we are beginning to see in some of our smaller communities, such as Canton, streets lined with standing dead ash trees that were killed by emerald ash borer. You're probably all aware of the fact they've now found it in Moorhead, just across the river from Fargo. That happened about a week or so ago. And I expect we're going to find more spots over the next couple of years, just kind of here and there throughout the eastern part of our state. And it would not surprise me if we find something West River, because people tend to carry firewood out to the hills. So I think we're at the beginning now where we're going to start seeing this showing up more and more. It'll be less noteworthy because we already have it. But nevertheless, we're kind of in that broad climb now. And we're already seeing windbreaks. You can drive through parts of Minnehaha and Lincoln County and take a look at ash trees lining either the river or in windbreaks. And they all have those signs of being infested with emerald ash borer. And so we all know ash is on the naughty list now. Nobody's looking to plant it anymore. And it used to be the go-to tree. So what I really appreciate, a lot of people are thinking, as Tony said, the need to diversify, that we got to think outside the box. And what other trees might we consider planting? Some of these may be, well, for trial. Let's see how well they work and then expand from there. Doesn't mean every one of these is going to be the perfect tree in every spot, but let's take a look at some. First one I'm going to talk about, and we're doing this kind of in alphabetical order by common name, but basswood. Basswood has some possibilities as a windbreak tree. And in fact, for some of you, it may work out well because it is very shade tolerant. It's a tree that you can use to fill in those rows after you've lost the ash, for example, because they'll grow in that shade in competition of the surrounding trees. And so it's one you may want to consider. It gets to be a fairly tall tree, well adapted to the eastern end of our state, and that it's in plant hardiness zone 3B. So you would think, well, we could grow it anywhere in the northern end of our state. And it will take wet soil. So it does have a 1 and a 2, which is poorly drained, and 3. But it would prefer 3. It would prefer a well-drained soil, and it will take alkaline up to about 7-8. Minimum precip really limits it, though, and that's at about 22 inches. Now, while it's very cold tolerant and will tolerate, lower rainfalls, it doesn't like dry air. And that's why you might say, well, gee, I should be able to grow that all the way to the river up to the north. You probably can in town. And in fact, I can find some really nice basswoods up in Mobridge, for example, but that's growing in town as opposed to out in the country. And that kind of limits it to a little bit further east in the state. By the way, a great honey tree for those that are looking at bees, and the flowers are quite fragrant, should add. But when we take a look at where to plant it, it's kind of east of that line that I've drawn there. What we're looking at is trying to use kind of highways, and you probably can look and say, yeah, I see that kind of lines up with Highway 14 and Highway 25 as ways of looking at it. But if you're in the southeast or the eastern part of our state, and it's not an extremely exposed site, basswood has some pretty good possibilities as an alternative to some of the other large trees that we might want to consider in the landscape and in windbreaks. One that I like, and I'm seeing a little bit more use is black cherry. Now, black cherry is not native to the States, not choke cherry. It doesn't seem to get black knot as often. And I noticed that when I lived out east too. Common choke cherry, that would get the black knot, but not the black cherry. And I rarely see the disease on black cherry. But it's an interesting cherry tree to be growing. Hardiness to 4A, so hardy throughout the state. Windbreak suitability, one is kind of pushing it, two would absolutely be not, because this tree does require well-drained soils. And so if it's a 1 and that water ponds a little bit, almost a 2, may not be one to consider. Put it this way, if in the spring you have standing water in a site, that's not a site for black cherry. It does better on the drier sites. And it is drought tolerant once established, but the first year, it has to have precipitation. Once you get through it, it can survive in an area with only 20 inches of precip. So a lot of areas in part of eastern South Dakota, it can do quite well in. Height, it's not going to get as big as it does out east. You're not going to find 80 footers. 30 to 40 feet is more common. When they're up on the northern end of our state, they're almost about the size of an amber maple tree. I apologize. And so more of a small tree than a tall tree. Again, out east, it gets quite tall. Growth rate is, you get into that foot or so a year, which is actually pretty good for about the first 20 years as it becomes established and is beginning to grow. There are a lot of people that like to pick the fruit on this. It is a real good cherry, not so much for fresh eating, but great for preserves and jellies and for wine. And there's a lot of people that do go out and harvest it. So it's a tree that actually has dual purposes. And you can do this in quite a lot of the areas of the state. Eastern end of it, again, if you take a look at our highway map, then going up along 281 on the eastern end of our state here, but Brown County, there are some in Edmond County. There are some windbreaks there even. It's getting a little farther west, of course. There, it's more of a small tree row, but they're doing okay as long as these are on well-drained soils, not wet soils. You get down to the very southeastern part of our state, though, they do extremely well and should be used more in that area. Box elder. I've become to really like box elder when I moved to South Dakota. Any tree that can grow in cast shade is worth something in a lot of areas of our state. And so this is a tree to consider in those tough growing conditions to which we have very limited choices. Ones that sometimes we just always said, well, we're going to plant ash. Hardy throughout the state, will tolerate dry soils, certainly does better on moist soils, tolerates alkaline soils, can do well up to about 7-8. More adapted to wet than to dry, but we've all seen them do well on dry sites here. Minimum precip about 18 inches once established, and good growth rates. I mean, 24 to 36 feet in 20 years. That's pretty incredible. One problem with them, of course, is they're very sensitive to growth regulator herbicides. Dicamba, 2,4-Ds, any of those products are going to twist the leaves and bend them. You can get a rather misshapen tree from it, but I think it's one we need to consider more often. And for those looking at ornamentals, there's actually a couple. And I want to give everyone a note of caution. The ornamental cultivars of box elder are not hardy in most of South Dakota. I know that sounds odd, but Kelly's Gold, for example, you can say South Dakota to it and it'll die. It's a tree that's really adapted to the eastern end of the country. I took this picture in Washington, D.C. to give you an idea of the sort of climate it actually does well in. And I occasionally get people ordering some of the cultivars of box elder, thinking, well, it's a box elder, it ought to be able to grow everywhere. No, the species will, Many of the cultivars will not. And there is one that I really like, and that's Sensation. Sensation, you really need a zone 5. So the very southern part of the southeastern part of our state, and then along the Black Hills, there's some great specimens in Rapid City and up in the Spearfish. I took this picture in Grand Junction, Colorado. I mean, it is well adapted to dry conditions. And by the way, it has a straight growth. So if you live out in the Rapid City area, or out in Spearfish, or you're down in Yankton County down in there, you can grow this one as an ornamental, as opposed to a windbreak. But it is kind of a nice one, and it's one of the few cultivars we can actually grow in the state. Now, where it does best is really East River, east of that dashed line there. But yes, we can grow it pretty much throughout the state. But the eastern part, where we're getting a little bit more rainfall, is really where it does extremely well. Honey locust. Now, honey locust can be grown as an ornamental. It frequently is. And if you're buying one as an ornamental, it would be the northern acclaim, because that's a zone 3 tree and will tolerate our cold climate. It was developed at North Dakota State University, and I think it's one of their better introductions. And for those that are looking at saying, well, I'm also selling trees as bare root to customers, and they're looking for a shade tree, this would be the one to get. Now, if you're going and saying, well, I'm using this for a windbreak, obviously those are seed grown, and the Big Sioux Nursery has done a very good job of collecting seeds that are well adapted to the state. And so I'm very comfortable with what they're providing. And I have seen more and more windbreaks of honey locust, seed grown honey locust. Now, this one, though, is, if you're growing it from seed, is not always adapted throughout the entire state. You know, you get about south of Highway 12, it does okay. You need to get out of that zone 4A area, and then it performs much better. Take a look at soils, though. It can tolerate wet, it can tolerate dry, it can tolerate alkaline, and does become fairly drought tolerant once it's established. Minimum precipitation is down to about 18 inches. So it is a tougher tree than a lot of people give it credit for, and it grows fast. You know, it's kind of like almost the same as a box elder in terms of requirements, if you get the right seed source. And I would suggest this gets used a little bit more often than it has been. One note of caution, it is a legume. It does produce a pod, as you can see in the picture. The problem with that is we do have herbicides, such as Milestone, that says do not use near legumes. And I get people that spray it around their honey locust trees, the ones in the windbreak, and they didn't think anything of it because they thought, well, it's a tree. What they forgot is we do have legume trees. Two of them that we use, honey locust, Kentucky coffee tree. So you really want to be careful with herbicide use around those two trees, because they are affected by some herbicides where many of our other tree species would not be. Oh, by the way, if you're growing them from seed, you might get the thorns. I don't see that as a negative, but you can find the lower trunks of some of the trees just covered with these branch thorns. Now, it's a good way to keep the deer away, but you don't want to poke your head in there either. They can get pretty darn sharp. Obviously, the ornamental ones, such as Northern Acclaim, don't have that problem. And I do want to mention this last spring, we lost a lot of honey locusts across state, not the ones grown from seed, the cultivars, and not the Northern Acclaim, which is from North Dakota. Many of our honey locust cultivars are not reliably hardy in South Dakota. Imperial, for example, we lost a number of those. What people notice is they leafed out in the spring and then quickly died. The number of calls I had last April and May from small honey locusts that just died. I mean, it was weekly. Now, again, not the seed grown ones, not the ones in the windbreaks, but some of the cultivars that people bought that are not quite reliably hardy in South Dakota. And we did have quite a good test winter. And with those, we end up getting canker diseases. and the trees slowly die, not a quick death. Honey locust, as I say, it's drought tolerant, so you can take it all the way out there. 281, you're getting close to the river, but nothing really north of 12. Now, again, I know some trees up there. There's certainly trees in towns such as Aberdeen, but if you're looking for a windbreak, you get much north of Falk, you're really kind of pushing the limits to it. And if you're south of that, I mean, there's some nice belts down in Hyde County and that. You get down into Douglas and that, and they do extremely well. So again, more of our tree for the east, and all the east except for that very northern area. Well, here's one that I would like to see a lot more use of, and the Big Sioux Nursery is growing this. And this is hop hornbeam, also known as ironwood. This is a small tree row. Now, it's not going to be a big tree. It's being used more and more in town plantings too. For example, our campus, we've got a bunch growing around here. It is native to South Dakota. It's native to the very eastern end of the state. You can find it up in Roberts and Marshall County, and you can find it growing out in the Black Hills, and you certainly can find it on the eastern edge of South Dakota, Newton Hills, down there. You can find it over in Camden State Park and Marshall. So it's a nice small tree to try, and it's tough. Hardiness zone 4, all of 4, so you could say 4A, and 1, 3, 4, and 4C. It will take some of the dry and somewhat poor sites. Moderately drought tolerant one once established. If you find it growing in the woods, it tends to grow on the drier locations rather than the wetter locations, and that, but you'll also occasionally find it along streams as well. It's will take slight alkaline conditions. If you had a 7-4 site, I wouldn't stop planting it. If you had an 8, I would. That's more of our honey locust territory. Minimum precip about 20. So it's not as drought tolerant as honey locust, as an example. And it's a small tree. So, you know, you're looking at 15 to 25 feet for height. And it's going to achieve that probably in about 20, 25 years. Now, an important note, if you do plant these trees bare root, these are like oaks. They do require sweating to really break bud consistently. But I love the hops to look at. You can't really use them for the bitter for beers, but nevertheless, kind of an interesting feature to them. No fall color, no flowers, so it's not really a prime ornamental, but it does add to the diversity. And for windbreaks, it's another tough tree to consider. And again, think of it as a honey locust almost in terms of growing. Maybe not quite as far west as honey locusts, but still most of the eastern part of the state, and then getting down into Tripp and Gregory County as well, where we do pick up a little bit more precipitation than most of West River. Japanese elm, I see that getting used more. Very fast growing tree, tough tree. They even use it up in Manitoba a little bit. There's some big nurseries up there that are growing it as well. It's kind of a interesting tree in that it is hardy to zone 3B, so we don't have to worry about hardiness in our state. And take a look at all the soils it can grow on. It's got a wide range of conditions in which it can grow, and it's very tolerant to droughty soils, which is a real plus, and alkaline tolerant. And that's why I think I see it more and more being used. It's a really tough elm. And we used to do a lot of elms, of course, before Dutch elm disease. The nice thing, this one, it's Japanese elm, so it's very tolerant of Dutch elm disease. That's not going to be a problem for you. And that, but look at the growth rate, 30 feet in 20 years in good sites. You know, this is a tree that has a lot more possibilities than it's being used. I mean, if you really want to grow it though, and again, 18, you could take it all the way out to the river, but really to get that 30 feet in 20 years, I like to be in a little bit more of the wetter areas of the state. And that's where it really performs best. Coffee tree. I'm seeing that used a little bit more. Again, the idea of adding to diversity. The one issue is, again, it's a legume. And I actually have gone out and looked at some belts that were killed with herbicide. And when I talked with the producer there, I said, what did you use? And they bring me the bottle. I always find that humorous. They always bring me what they bought. They go, well, I haven't really read it for the trees. And I get that. But it'll say no legumes. And I'll say, these are legumes. Oh, I didn't know that. Well, that's why you lost them. But a fairly adaptable tree. Zones 1 and 3, you'll find it also listed for 5. Drought tolerant once established, and that's kind of critical. A lot of these trees do require moisture to get them started. More of a neutral pH, up to about 7.3. I've seen them on a little bit more alkaline sites, and they seem to perform okay to it, but it can tolerate dry conditions once established. And it's faster growing than a lot of people realize. In fact, this is a tree that starts out very slow. The first 5 years, it's barely going to grow. You put sticks in the ground and they look like sticks, and then they start to grow. So when we say that growth rate, 22 to 26 feet in 20 years, for windbreak conditions, that doesn't mean every year they're going to grow about a foot. What you're going to find for those first 5 years, they may grow inches. And then they really start to growing, that putting on, foot and a half even. And so if you look at them 20 years out, there's actually some pretty nice sized trees. They do have a flower, which is more fragrant than visible. They have that large leaf that's broken down into these very small leaflets to it. They do produce a pod if you're growing them from seed. Now, for windbreak condition, those pods are not a problem at all. Just let them drop. Not much will eat them. And what few can eat them, no seeds will germinate from them. But for urban areas, that true north is probably a good cultivar to use. It's male. And so you generally are not going to see any pods on it. But those pods can be a mess. Another thing to pick up in the spring. Now, if you're using this tree for a windbreak, here's an interesting thing. You're looking at a grove of Kentucky coffee tree right there. And if you look at the ground, you'll find a lot of seed pods that are breaking open. And you look and you go, oh, they must be germinating from seed. No, this tree root suckers. If you quit mowing your lawn and you had a coffee tree in it, you will have a grove of coffee trees. So think of that if you're going to use it as a windbreak. Is that going to be a positive or a negative for you? That over time, this is going to fill in that space because it root suckers prolifically. And that you might say, hey, that's great. That's what I want. Something that's going to add to some density. Others, you might say, no, I want really nice rows. This may not be the tree for you. It's not going to spread like wildfire, but it is going to fill in when you're doing it. Again, it is drought tolerant enough. You can go to the river, and in town, you certainly can. There's some nice trees all the way up into Mobridge. And by the way, there's some nice trees in town in Phillip. I can find them across the state in town. But out in the country where they're going to be subjected to poor growing conditions, and we're probably not going to get the precipitation. Nobody's going to water them. Really, again, this is a tree best limited to the eastern half of East River, and then getting down to Tripp and Gregory County again, because they do get a little bit more moisture in that. So a little bit more humidity, a little bit more moisture, and this tree performs extremely well. Northern Catalpa. Now, unfortunately, this is going to be a tree again for a very particular area of the state. You'll notice we don't have any more easy trees. We can say you can grow this anywhere. We've used that box up. The good old American elm, the ash, for example, green ash. No, now you're going to be a little choosier. But in areas that have a very good growing condition, Northern Catalpa has a possibility for it. Zone 4B, So even though you can find them all the way to the North Dakota border, I don't recommend them. Why? You get a tough winter, they will winter kill. If you'd come into Brookings 10 years ago, there were a lot more catalpas in town than there are now. We had a slightly colder than normal winter, and we lost lots of them. Some are still around, but that gives you kind of an idea. And in a windbreak situation, you don't want to have it like, well, I lost half the trees in the windbreak. Interesting enough, this is drought tolerant once established. So it'll take the drier location state, and it's alkaline tolerant, and it's got a very good growth rate. You look at that, 18 to 28 feet in 20 years. That's not bad. And this tree tends to grow fast in the beginning and then slows down. So you get some height growth right away. But really, that's where you're best limited. So it's going to be one of those trees that, quite honestly, that's the area you can grow lots of different trees. And maybe that's a good area we ought to be diversifying more, since you have the possibility. But you might want to consider northern catalpa. Relatively pest-free, very good growth rate, tolerant of alkaline and droughty sites. Just doesn't like cold winters north of about Highway 14 where Brookings is. And you get further west than that, it doesn't perform quite as well either. But you can get it down to Tripp County, and I've seen some down there look great. And by the way, this is again a tree I can find them growing in town, up in Mobridge, for example. Well, shagbark hickory, I wish we could grow it in more locations than we do. It is a phenomenal tree. That's a picture of one growing in Brookings, South Dakota, but it's growing in town in Brookings, of course. But where we can grow it, it is a very interesting tree. This tree here, it's got about 4B. So again, it's limited in hardiness. It does like moist, well-drained soils and not excessively alkaline. Minimum precip, it'll take dry once established, but just down to about 20. And it's not a fast-growing tree. That's not what hickories do. You can figure about a foot a year. And that now what's interesting, the leaves look a lot like an ash. The bark doesn't. But that's where you're really going to be growing it. You know, if you say, John, I'm looking for something for Lincoln County, it's a great tree to try. Brookings County, yep, we can do it. They do extremely well in Brookings County. I might even say, well, I'm going to try a couple in Hamlin or something like that. But the farther north you go, the slower the growth rate. And we're probably going to start seeing some winter injury. I like the eastern end because this is a tree, while it'll tolerate dry conditions, to really perform well, it does need more of that 22, 24 inch annual precipitation. Well, we're losing a lot of our ash to emerald ash borer, or we will lose it to emerald ash borer. Throughout the state, we are now losing a lot of our Austrian and Scots pines to pine wilt disease. That disease is now throughout the entire state. It's taken a while, but it's a small little nematode that's carried by Sawyer beetles. And the unfortunate thing about this disease, once the tree is infected, it's going to die in weeks or months, not years. This is one where people say, gosh, the trees look good in the summertime, and then we're dead by fall. And I'll give you another clue. If you've got two rows, or you have a row where you've intermixed Scots pines and ponderosa, for example, or Austrian pines and ponderosa, you'll look at that row and all you'll find is the exotic pine, the non-native pine, the Austrian or the Scots pines being affected, but not the ponderosa. They are not troubled by the nematode and that. But boy, Scots pines, take a look at this windbreak over in Minnehaha County. Every one of their pine trees were killed along this row here. And the spruce aren't much happier either, but it's not due to pine wilt. One of my favorite little groves is just about near the Del Rapids exit along I-29. You look to the west, and this beautiful little grove of Scots pines. And I've been watching it now for the last 3 years, just slowly being killed. In fact, I think by the end of this year, 2023, I think the entire grove will be dead. And that took it about 5 years. But again, we can't use those two pines anymore, either Austrian or Scots. They are going to be killed by pine wilt disease. And we're trying to get rid of Colorado spruce. I mean, it's got way too many needle diseases, stigmania and rhizosphaera. And after about 20 years, they start looking pretty poor. So what are we going to do for evergreens? What's some choices there? Well, it's like the deciduous trees. They're not going to work in every situation. And in fact, the more you're in that southeastern part of the state, the more options you have. But let's take a look at some. One would be Myers spruce, and I know that's getting used quite a bit more. There's some nice ones over in Sully County that are performing extremely well. And again, a little farther west than quite often they're planted, but nevertheless doing well there. And that I'm seeing more and more. And some of them, take a look out. Look at that color. That's a belt up north. Let's see, that would have been north of Aberdeen, for example. And it's doing extremely well. We'll take alkaline soils. Moist soils are best, but look at the minimum precip. It'll take to 18. It's a spruce that's a little bit more drought tolerant than people give it credit to. But the negative, spruce are really starvation food for deer, but there's a lot of starving deer out there this year because of the yarding. So I'm seeing a lot of damage on spruce. But the softer needles on the Myers spruce make these apparently tasty any year. And so sometimes I see where they're not growing very well, and it's primarily because of deer. But man, you look at some belts going into this tree, and I've been very impressed. It does not grow as fast as Colorado spruce. That'll be your disappointment. And you'll say, or whoever you plant it for, it didn't grow as fast. No, it won't. Maybe about a fourth less per year. So noticeable, but still long term, a far better tree. And some of the belts are just spectacular. A softer needle, which is the way you identify it, and the cone looks quite different. Looks more like a white spruce cone, what we call a Black Hill spruce in South Dakota, except it's longer. It's about the length of a Colorado spruce cone, but Colorado spruce would have a little groove at each one of those. But look at this one. That's deer. They browse it every year, so it just stays as a beach ball. The worst place to put a Myers spruce belt is next to a bunch of cedars where the deer can hide and hang out and yard all winter. And they'll be happy to come out and shear your little Myers spruce. But notice that entire eastern end of the state, you can grow it and have it do fairly well. Norway spruce. I'm hearing more interest in Norway spruce. And we do have it growing in a lot of areas of the state in town. All right, but what can we do elsewise? I mean, it's kind of an interesting tree, and I am seeing more belts of this tree. In fact, what you're looking at in the background is a mature belt. It's already been cut up in that, and it's now part of the homestead and that, but you're looking at a belt there what was 50, 60 years old of Norway spruce. Hardiness 4B, though, that's the southern half of the state, not the northern. And again, fairly wide range of soil types, not particularly alkaline tolerant, but will not be really affected by it. Minimum precip is 20, but is not as drought tolerant as Black Hills, but better growth everywhere else. So put it this way. If you have difficulty growing Black Hill spruce on that site, don't try Norway spruce. If you're getting good growth of Black Hill spruce on the site and you're looking to diversify, this is a spruce to consider. Interesting cones. Cones are the largest of any of the spruces. That can be 6 to 8 inches long, but despite the fact it's a pretty nice tree, my recommendation is stay in that southeast. It does like a little bit more humid air. And of course, that's where we really have the humidity, is down in that area. Doug fir, though, does deserve better use or more use throughout the state. And that here's a belt of them down in Minnehaha County where it's certainly going to perform extremely well. And I was very impressed. I think that's what did he tell me? I think that was about 8 or 9 years ago they planted these. And this is the Rowan is Windbreak conifer. And man, the trees are just phenomenal. So if we take a look at it now, by the way, it has to be the Rocky Mountain Douglas fir, not the coastal Douglas fir. The Rocky Mountain Douglas fir will do extremely well. Hardy throughout the state. Again, as a conifer, 1 in 3 is probably where you're using, but it will take alkaline soils. And it's fairly drought tolerant, more so than people give it credit for. It's not the fastest growing. Take a look at the growth rate, 15 to 20 feet per year, or excuse me, per 20 years in that. So if you plant this, you're going to find that your spruce outperform it in terms of growth. But for long-term performance, this may be a better option. It's much fewer pest problems to it. And you go up in the northern part of our state, and you'll find it in all these cemeteries, just huge ones, outgrowing on harsh sites. Here's a beautiful Douglas fir, along with a couple of other spruce, just planted out, middle of nowhere. Used to be a homestead out there, and now it's just a tree growing, and it's doing extremely well. And there's one of my favorites. That's a Douglas fir growing in Lemon, South Dakota. And every year I'm there, I take a picture of it. Got a little lean to it with the wind, but otherwise doing very well. Now, I don't recommend it's a windbreak that far, but again, it does have a lot of options and an interesting cone. But I think I look at this more like Meyer spruce, a pretty good tree throughout East River, and then, of course, getting down into Tripp and Gregory County and that. But if you're at the eastern end of the state, eastern half, or the Black Hills too, it would be a good tree to give a try. Now, this one, a number of states are really looking at closer. And this is lodgepole pine and also jack pine. The two are very, very close related. Jack pine is found east of here. Lodgepole pine's found west of here. There's a native stand of it in the Black Hills. Jack pine you can find native to Minnesota, for example, and they look very similar. And here's one growing in Gettysburg, South Dakota, and it's doing extremely well, but it needs to be the Rocky Mountain lodgepole pine. Okay. 2B, you can grow it in your freezer, and it's adapted to fairly dry sites, 6, 7, and 8 even. So it's a very drought tolerant tree. Minimum precipitation about 18 inches. Some states are looking at this as a substitute for red cedar. It's going to get a little taller than red cedars do, but it's a fairly narrow tree. And because of the problems with eastern red cedar and Rocky Mountain juniper becoming, I don't want to call it invasive because they're native plants, but nevertheless taking over pastures and growing up in other unwanted areas, people are looking at, is there something else we could use for a windbreak? Well, this has some possibilities. However, it's a more open canopy than what we find. The cones, by the way, just stay on forever. It's a serotinous cone. The only time it opens is when it heats up enough from a fire, and then will drop. The same though, even though it's really tough, East River's really what I'm looking at. West River maybe as a trial. Maybe somebody might want to go out and plant a short row of them, see how they do in that, because they do perform well in Montana. Outside of the mountains, but there's a few planted out in the prairie end of it. And so I think it's got more worth trying. And of course, Siberian larch. That is one tough tree. Look at this, zone 2, another one you can grow in your freezer. And I can find these trees throughout the state. Not a lot because it's a deciduous evergreen, and people tend to want an evergreen that's evergreen and that doesn't tolerate poorly drained soils. I will say that. On the heavy clay wet soils, no, that's not larch country, and this would not be one to plant. But it will take up to about 7-8, and look at the precept down to 16 inches. And I've seen some nice ones West River on this. Growth rate isn't as fast as it could be because we're looking at it on harsher sites in South Dakota. By the way, too, much better success if planted in small pots rather than bare root. Even though it's a deciduous evergreen, so it drops its needles. This is really one that I rather see containered. And I've seen this do well in really droughty conditions. And just grow like gangbusters. And in the fall, you get this yellow, almost a golden yellow fall color. However, yes, during the winter, it looks like a dead spruce. No way around it. Here's some of the Big Sioux nursery again, and that's the way I like to plant them is in pots. Much better and quicker establishment than this. And even though they'll take 16 inches of precip, getting them watered that first year is still pretty critical. But again, I look at it more East River than West, but nevertheless, it's 16 inches of precip, and I have seen trees out in Perkins and Corson County. In fact, one of the pictures I showed you was belt, one of the rows in one in Corson County. So again, it's got a little more options than our other quote evergreens. Well, that's it for today. And again, I know if you say, well, gee, I'm in Turner County, thanks for all the other options. Yep. But if you say, hey, John, I'm up in Perkins County, there wasn't a lot of additional ones. And you're right. They just don't have the quite range that we have as farther west you go. But obviously there are things to consider and plants to try. So I really appreciate you watching today. I hope you found it interesting and will find it valuable. If you are an ISA certified arborist, here is your code for watching today, DS23009. And I might add to any of our viewers here, the code is for the live session. If you're someone who comes on and watches it a month from now and that, you'll find the code is already expired for that. So if you're ISA certified arborist, note the code, submit it for your credentials, and you're set. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Tony and see if we got any questions. And we do have a few minutes for questions and want to make sure we had that. So Tony, do we have anything out there?
Thanks, Dr. Paul. I do not see any questions in the chat box at the moment. Just send out a reminder if anybody does have one. Now is your chance. Additionally, any other SAF certified foresters that would like to receive a CEU, please include your credential number in the chat box before you leave. I did get a question here pop up, Dr. Ball. What about poplars as a tree?
Yes, and thank you for that one. And the reason I did not cover it is because those are already fairly well known and are utilized quite a bit. I'll address that a little bit more in next month then, because I do appreciate the question for that. But the only thing I would say for poplars is I've become a big fan for the native cottonwoods as opposed to cultivars such as Siouxland, which was developed by South Dakota State. Those tend to be rather short-lived. They're more of 20-year trees. And if someone said, I'm looking for a quick screen, some of the hybrids do fairly well short-term, fast growth rate in that, but they just don't have the longevity. And I've seen some very good performance out of just the native seed-growing cottonwoods. And a couple, I can see a question here too. Is black cherry poisonous to horses? Thank you. And that's yes, I do have that in my book, Trees for the Northern Plains. Black cherry, it's not the fruit, but as with all our cherries, if a branch breaks and the wilted leaves hang from it and a horse browses those, there is enough cyanide in that they can kill a horse. They are kind of bitter, and that's why deer won't bother them. Horses don't seem to understand that. And out east, there are poisonings of horses with black cherry. But again, what the horse has to do is usually it's late summer, broken branches where the leaves wilt then and concentrate it. That's what'll kill the horse. If a few leaves in the fall go across the pasture and they happen to chew on those too, that's not going to be an issue. Was there another tree species too? I thought I saw one there.
You asked about mulberry.
Oh, all right. You know what? That's one I should have talked about, and I apologize. I'll make sure that we add that onto next month's to talk about. Mulberry people hate and love. Reason they hate it is because of the messy fruit, and the reason they love it is it's tough as nails. It is a nether tree that is well adapted to the state. In fact, some might say too well adapted, because it will start popping up in areas you may not want it. And by that, I mean vacant lots and such. But I'll add that to the next month's edition. Look at this as a continual conversation. And I've also seen the chat box, Tony, not too surprising. A couple of things. Hey, could we get a few more options for West River? Yes. We'll look at a few more options for West River too, but you out there, as you well know, you're playing with kind of half a box of crayons.
That's right. Well, I also I want to add in the chat box quick before we go here. We added a handout covering basically this information that you went through today, all these different tree species. So I've put in the link there on our website. You can find a clear, concise document with all the Dr. Ball's recommendations on that website under the Windbreak page, agroforestry page there. Next month, we will have ornamental trees. We'll touch on a few more species as we move into our planting season. So I don't see any other questions at this point. Last call, I suppose, for SAF credentials. If you are an ISA certified arborist, make sure to take down that code, the DS23009 code, and submit that yourself on the ISA website. Thank everybody for your time. Thank you, Dr. Ball.
You bet. Thank you, everybody. Talk to you next month.